Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. This is our third session of the spring semester's Education Policy Colloquium, sponsored by the Program of Education Policy and Governance. My name is Jim Pizer. I'm an academic visitor here at Kennedy School and a former Secretary of Education in Massachusetts. It's my pleasure to work alongside Professors Paul Peterson and Marty West. Marty is here with us today. Paul may be on the Zoom call, but it's great to be here and thank you for coming. In addition to today's event, we've got 5 more sessions coming up this semester, mostly at noon, mostly at Taubman, although we do have one on April 18th. I think I'm getting the date right, which is going to be over at Gutman Library at the Graduate School of Education. And it's going to be on the topics that are coming up are on things like chronic absenteeism, analyzing student test data, the effectiveness of preschool, the importance and impact of teacher diversity, as well as kind of the state of academic achievement post-COVID. And our next session, which is in 2 weeks, so it's not next week, so we're not going to spoil your spring break. But in 2 weeks here in Taubman, we're going to have Aaron Lawton of Curriculum Associates speaking, who will be talking about trends in elementary education achievement based on Curriculum Associates interim data sets. So this is not sort of state data or other sort of district-run assessment data per se, but it's the assessments that are delivered by Curriculum Associates as part of their engagement with schools and school districts, which I think on the one hand gives us sort of a different slice of student achievement and in some ways some more new analytical ways of understanding it, but also maybe giving us a little bit of a preview of what results are going to be like this coming spring. Today's session is focused on the effects and efficacy of tutoring, a topic that's gained a tremendous amount of attention and traction as a result of the COVID experience and the challenge of accelerating learning to get students back on track. But of course, tutoring isn't new. In fact, I got my sort of start in my education reform journey as a tutor at Boston High School. And although I can say with confidence that my efforts did little to move the needle for students, I'm also thankful that I'm probably not in any of the data sets that you've been looking at. But I was untrained. I had no curriculum to work with. I got no sort of support or really any interaction with the teachers. I would describe it more as homework help rather than tutoring, which historically and even today may be a lot of what tutoring looks like. But more recently, tutoring, as I said, has become a hot topic and much more organized and better funded, especially in our public schools. It used to be that tutoring was primarily a private activity, which in 2021 accounted for something like $25 billion. So it's actually a pretty big industry, but mostly historically anyway, outside the public school system. But in particular supported by federal ESSER funds, billions of dollars are now being spent on tutoring in public schools and districts across the country, all of which raises the question of, does it work? And if it does, or if it doesn't, why? And of course, can we afford it? Thankfully, Beth Schueler is here to help us answer these questions based on the research that she and her colleagues have been doing to review the findings of a few hundred studies on the subject. Beth is no stranger to Harvard. She has her EDD from here and did her postdoc research fellowship at Kennedy School before heading south to become assistant professor of education and public policy at the University of Virginia. Among other things, she's done groundbreaking research on the impact of state interventions in low-performing school and districts, including a deep dive study here in Massachusetts of the receivership in Lawrence. After Beth's comments, we'll have an opportunity to have questions and answers and more discussion. I'll involve obviously all the folks in the room, but hopefully we've got some folks online who may be interested in asking a question or making a comment. If you want to get involved in your online, please sort of enter your question or your comment in the chat and we will try to get to it before the session is done. The session is being recorded, so everything is on the record. And the recording will be posted on the website in a few days after the event. And with that, it's my privilege to turn it over to Beth Schueler.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction, and thanks everybody for being here. I'm very glad to be in my old stomping grounds, see some familiar faces and new ones as well. And eager to tell you all a little bit about some of this work that I've been doing. This is in collaboration with Matt Kraft and Grace Falcon at Brown University, and we've been doing this meta-analytic work on tutoring. This is the first time we presented this work, so there's lots of opportunities for your feedback to kind of shape our direction going forward. And I should say, you know, a large team of folks that have really been involved in helping us code up these studies and collect them at both Brown and UVA. All right, so the big picture motivation for our exploration of this topic is, I think, grounded in this fundamental challenge for educators and kind of education policymakers, which is this idea that students have very different learning needs, which means, you know, you're going to want to kind of differentiate your instruction to maximize their learning. And we've got a pretty significant body of literature, rigorous research suggesting that kind of in concept, these efforts to differentiate and individualize instruction can work to really improve student learning. But this individualized instruction is resource intensive, and we've got limited resources, which means in practice, at the moment, students, for the most part, are grouped with teachers in a larger group, and access to these individualized resources tends to be reserved for folks whose parents can afford the services on the private market. And so we were really interested in this question of, how can we think about kind of democratizing access to individualized resources within the public school system? And how can we do that without kind of diluting the efficacy and the impact of and the quality of these programs? And so to get at that question, we are going to update the tutoring review literature. We think this is the largest meta-analysis to date of tutoring impact evaluation. So we collected about 300 studies with over 2,500 estimates. And we're going to use this larger set of estimates to try to look at variation and impacts across kind of dimensions that are relevant for sort of scaling tutoring more widely. So just to give you a preview of kind of what we find, we do replicate the kind of large effects that prior scholars have found in the tutoring impact literature, but we're going to show you some evidence that suggests that these estimates are somewhat kind of inflated by studies that we argue are not particularly well suited to generalize to the kind of ongoing efforts to scale tutoring in the kind of US public school system. And despite those kind of inflated expectations, we're still going to argue that even the more policy relevant estimates, the size is going to be smaller, but are still very meaningful in terms of the magnitude of the impacts. And they're sort of consistent across a range of sort of age groups, subjects, and also program design features. So it seems like a pretty promising approach, even when implemented in a variety of different settings and ways. But there are some program features that seem to be more predictive of larger impacts than others. And so we'll tell you about those features as well. So we were interested in this question of individualized instruction kind of leading prior to the pandemic, but obviously, as Jim mentioned, the pandemic created this shock, which these are NAEP scores, national assessment scores that show big declines in reading and math, as well as, patterns suggesting kind of exacerbated inequality on educational outcomes, which kind of heightened the need for interventions that have the potential to kind of differentiate and address this inequality. At the same time, in the midst of the pandemic, we already had some, evidence on this question of individualized instruction. Most notably, there was a review that came out in the summer of 2020, a meta-analysis of 96 tutoring interventions, Nickow et al. Paper, that showed really large pooled effects of tutoring interventions on the order of 0.37 standard deviations. And, for any researchers in the room, that is a really big number, that if any of us kind of saw that in our, in our results, we'd make sure, like, did I make a mistake here? This is really big, right? So, just to put this in perspective, it's about the same size as, kind of depending on the estimate you use, the average gains that an elementary school student makes over the course of an entire school year, right, is similar in magnitude. It's also more than twice the size of the average impact from other educational interventions that have been evaluated by randomized control trials. So these are really big, is kind of the point. And there are a number of other more kind of comparative reviews that look across different types of educational interventions, where the authors conclude that tutoring is among the most kind of impactful interventions with the biggest impacts that have been documented by this kind of rigorous research. So we had this evidence, and so we see a kind of pretty incredibly rare example of sort of convergence between a national policy agenda, research evidence, and in some ways what I think many teachers and principals and parents kind of wanted for kids at this moment, which was to try to use this individualized instruction to address these learning disruptions that COVID had brought on. And so, I won't belabor this. Jim already mentioned a number of the kind of national initiatives and investments, including federal emergency relief. Tutoring has been a kind of dominant approach to those student learning acceleration efforts. There are also a number of kind of statewide initiatives where states are trying to implement high dosage tutoring at scale. And so, I think widespread interest and offerings, but some signs that the kind of reality of the implementation has not been, quite as universal. So when the federal government in, last year asked public schools, 80% of them reported offering some form of tutoring. But there was, signs of variation in quality. So more like 37% said we're offering high dosage tutoring. That's more aligned to, I think, what researchers would think of as kind of the gold standard design, but that's still a high number, 37% offering it. But then, when you think about take up and whether students are actually receiving tutoring, on average, schools are saying about 11% are actually receiving tutoring. And it's not clear to me when schools, say high dosage, what they really mean by that. Does it align with the kind of gold standard design and sort of evidence base? And in particular, I think they're, in part because of public health concerns, but also because of scalability issues, this move to think about virtual tutoring, which, came with a much smaller kind of evidence base. We just know much less about the impacts of virtual tutoring than we do about this in-person high dosage tutoring. So, there's those challenges, and then additional kind of ongoing and sort of future challenges to be thinking about when, considering how we scale this, including, a tough labor market. So schools are reporting it's hard to staff these programs, and that's especially so in schools serving low-income communities. Got high levels of administrative staff turnover that can make it hard to sustain programs if principals and, district leaders are running these programs. Tough to share best practices across schools and districts in our decentralized system. And of course, the ESSER funding is going to come to an end before long, which makes it kind of uncertain how, or if schools and districts are going to kind of sustain these federally funded programs going forward. And then, outside of the COVID context, I think it's just, there's a lot of evidence to suggest from education and public policy, and, beyond education that, we see often big effects for your kind of boutique pilot program, and then smaller effects when there are attempts to try to kind of scale those programs more widely. So scaling is difficult. All right, so what we're going to do is try to address what we see as kind of this disconnect in that we've got these past reviews of empirical evidence suggesting really large impacts of tutoring, but then some suggestive evidence that the programs, as they've been taken to scale, maybe have fallen short of some of our highest expectations. And so we're going to address that by updating the tutoring review literature with this meta-analysis and try to answer two questions that we hope will be helpful for policymakers. One is, okay, what are realistic expectations for the effects of tutoring on academic achievement, especially when you try to, bring them to scale, when they're kind of implemented as part of a more scalable effort within the kind of K-12 public education system in the US. So we'll identify a subset of the studies that we'll argue are sort of more generalizable to what policymakers are thinking of, right? They want to know how much is this going to improve my standardized test scores, and what about when I kind of, implement a larger program in this US context. And then the second question is, how do what we'll kind of describe as scaling and cost-cutting approaches predict the impact of tutoring programs? So by scaling, we mean things like virtual programming, larger program size, implementing your program as part of the school day and at the school site. And by cost-cutting, we're going to look at things like student tutor ratios, dosage, and tutor type. Okay. And by the way, I should say, please feel free to interrupt me if you have clarifying questions or like that. All right, so to do this, we started by kind of searching the literature, a number of both academic databases as well as kind of working paper series. We didn't put any kind of time constraints on our search, and we ended up with about 14,000 documents. We sort of scanned the titles and abstracts for relevance, and that got us down to 1,300 studies, which we subjected to more kind of rigorous inclusion review about whether the study should end up in our sample. That left us with these 300 studies I mentioned, which were coded by a large team of coders. We were sort of double coding all the studies and reconciling discrepancies with the co-authors as a team. We coded a number of different things related to the characteristics of the studies, the characteristics of the context in which these interventions were implemented, the intervention, features themselves, the research methods that were used, the actual effect estimates, and then we did collect some information about costs as well that I can tell you about if there's time. So how did studies end up in our sample? There were sort of 8 inclusion criteria. So we were again looking for impact evaluations of tutoring interventions. To end up in our sample, the study had to be evaluating a program that used, human beings as tutors. So we excluded studies that were just of kind of computer-assisted learning on its own without a person. Second, most of the studies were, it either had to be a one-on-one kind of tutoring intervention or a small group. So the cutoff was 15. Had to be 15 or fewer students per tutor. Third, the focus had to be academic content. So we excluded, for example, studies of mentoring programs or programs focused, exclusively on kind of social emotional learning. Fourth, the study had to report reading or math test score outcomes and provide enough information that we could calculate a standardized effect size that would allow us to compare across studies. The 2 Ts had to be K-12 students. They had to be based in OECD countries. So we do have some international studies in our sample. In terms of the methodology, we excluded studies that were not randomized control trials because we actually ended up finding most of the studies in this literature qualified for that. There weren't as many quasi-experimental studies as we kind of thought. And of course, these RCTs allow us to feel more confident in the kind of, validity of the causal estimate that these studies were really capturing the causal effect of tutoring programs. And then we dropped some, we would exclude studies that had very, very small sample sizes, like a dissertation that studied, 6 students, for example. All right, so we end up with this sample of 300 studies, most of them published in the 21st century. A large majority in peer-reviewed journals, but some variation on that dimension of publication type. I want to point out a large majority focused on the elementary grades as opposed to middle and high school, and that's going to become important later on. Most in the public schools, about 80% or more in the US, but some international studies as well. And then a big share, about half, with small kind of treatment groups, fewer than 40 kids in the treated group. Thanks.
Yep.
In terms of the interventions being evaluated, most of, the majority were focused on programs implemented at schools and during school hours, although we'll capitalize on some variation in the timing and location of the interventions. Again, some interesting variation in the ratios, a variety of different tutor types, folks that are gonna potentially be paid, require different levels of compensation to do the tutoring. And then we coded information on sort of the dosage, which what I'll show you today. We've calculated a sort of cumulative measure of the total hours that kids were experienced tutoring. And I should say, we don't show it here because virtually all of the studies indicated that the students being tutored were targeted based on either low performance or some characteristic that would make them sort of more at risk for low performance.
Beth, how did you think about the duration of the timing? So there's the number of hours per week or per year. But you have this hours of total dosage?
Yeah.
Is that over any period of time?
It's like the total, because some of the programs were like 2 weeks long and some of
Yeah.
the programs were a whole year. So this is like the cumulative, like total amount of hours you received tutoring over the course of the entire program before we see a measure of the impact.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious whether that total amount of time one of the characteristics that you captured for the studies, or is it not? Like not the total dosage, but the duration, like whether it was a semester long, year long, month long, 2 weeks long.
Yes, we did. Yeah, maybe that would be a good thing to report here. The total, well, I guess weeks per year. I don't know that we had any. That's a good question, whether we had any studies that went beyond a year. Can look into that. I think the vast majority did not, but we should double check that. Okay, so we coded up these studies and then we calculate standardized effect sizes for each of the estimates. And then we're going to use meta-analysis, specifically this robust variance estimation approach, which does two things. First of all, it kind of weights estimates that are from studies with larger sample sizes and that are kind of estimated with more precision, more heavily than smaller studies. And it also is going to account for the fact that for some of the studies, we've got multiple studies are reporting multiple estimates. Maybe there's multiple treatment arms or multiple outcomes, et cetera. And so we're going to account for that nesting of estimates within studies. And then we'll also use meta-regressions, which will basically introduce into this equation a kind of vector of moderators, characteristics of the studies and the tutoring programs to kind of test, for example, whether a particular intervention feature, whether it predicts larger impacts, even after controlling for other features of the studies or the interventions. And that's important because, we've got this empirical challenge when we're trying to understand what are promising program features for tutoring, which is that even when you can pool estimates that you're confident are, causal estimates of the intervention in question, those pooled estimates are not going to provide causal estimates of the individual program characteristics. Okay, and that's true for two reasons. One is observable characteristics of the programs might be correlated with each other. So say, for example, many of the virtual programs use volunteer tutors, and we see lower impacts for the virtual programs. It becomes hard to isolate. Is that because it was a virtual program or because of the volunteer nature of the program, right? So program characteristics could be correlated. But it could also be that there's sort of unobserved aspects of program quality that are also correlated with some of these program features. So say, for example, these high dosage programs that are considered to be kind of the gold standard just happen to be implemented by, administrators that are much more conscientious and, charismatic. And so it's really a leadership effect, not a high dosage effect that we're kind of detecting when we see those higher impacts. So meta-regression will address number one, right? Because we can look at the relationship between virtual tutoring and effects controlling for something like volunteerism, but it's not going to address number two. And so there still could be these unobserved factors. And I just want to say that up front before presenting the results to kind of make sure we're all exercising caution and reminding myself to do that too when we're interpreting these results, because even a meta-regression isn't going to be able to kind of fully isolate the causal effect of a particular program feature. All right, so what do we find? I'm going to start by kind of answering this research question about what are realistic expectations for tutoring effects. But first I'll show you the kind of naive pooled estimates. So these are, meta-analytic pooled estimates and so here we're kind of pooling across subjects. Here we're pooling across grade levels, and then we kind of break it down so you can see how this seems to vary across subjects and grades. But this is the pooled estimate where we're pooling subjects and grade levels together. And so, as I kind of previewed, we basically replicate this finding of a very large impact of tutoring studies in this kind of naive big sample on the order of 0.41 standard deviation units. That we see big impacts descriptively for both subjects. And it appears at first like the impacts are smaller, although still large and meaningful for older kids than for younger kids. But one thing I want to point out is it turns out a lot of this is going to be driven by these estimates of programs implemented with little kids in lower elementary school for reading. So, over 1,400 of our estimates fall in that category. We're testing lower elementary reading programs, 1,400 of our 2,500 estimates, okay? And so when we put this into a meta regression where we're like looking at the relationship between grade and subject and the outcomes, controlling for other features of the studies and the program characteristics, we don't actually find meaningful differences across grade level groups or across subjects, which is, maybe good news, maybe encouraging, right, for policymakers who are looking to make an impact on both subjects and across grade levels. So that was kind of the naive estimate, right? Is this kind of 0.4 number? But then we started to think about, okay, what's more realistic? So the first thing is, we noticed a lot of the studies were relying on sort of researcher designed assessments that were, probably we guessed very narrowly tailored to the interventions that were being studied. And so we said, well, what happens if we limit our sample only to those studies that look at sort of standardized test outcomes? And we see the impact, get a bit smaller, down to 0.36 here. And then we noticed the international studies seem to have higher impacts descriptively than the US studies, although that part doesn't kind of hold up to meta regression. But let's limit to US studies because that's the context we're interested in generalizing to. And we see the effect size get a little smaller there as well. And then we really see a big decrease when we limit our sample to studies where the treatment was implemented with groups of 100 kids or more. So, we see a kind of halving of the effect size to 0.19 standard deviation units when we limit to that sample. And so just to be clear, right, this is a big decrease even before we account for any kind of differences in sort of program design features. And, I think, so that's a big difference, like half of the effect, but 0.187, I want to be clear, is still a big and meaningful impact and kind of large in magnitude relative to what we often see in educational interventions.
Beth, is the number of treated students the number of treated students in the study sample, or
Yes.
is it in the program that's under study?
Yeah, it's in the study sample, which
It's probably correlated with program under study, but maybe it's a different, so it's
That's
not
true.
necessarily a measure of the scale of the program.
yeah, like it could be that they implemented it with the first priority kids, and then, only did the randomization part with a subset or something
Sure,
like that.
sure.
Yeah. Wonder, we might be able to look at that. So that's a good point. And maybe a limitation of what we've done here, but hopefully suggestive. So, this is, I'm just showing you kind of the same results for the same sample that I just mentioned, where again, we're limiting to studies reporting standardized test outcomes, US-based studies, and studies with more than 100 treated students. So again, the pooled estimate here is that 0.187. And, the thing that I thought was interesting to point out here is just this much smaller impact for those lower elementary reading interventions, which seem to really be driven by those small sample studies where it's fewer than 100 students receiving treatment. All right, so I'm going to move on. And when I go forward for the rest of the results, we'll continue dropping the researcher designed assessment results, but I'm not going to otherwise continue limiting the sample to this 100 students or more, just because that really, knocks down our sample size and ability to kind of compare across. So caution, I think we need to do more to look into whether the rest of these results hold up to those kinds of explorations. All right, so with this bigger sample, another dimension we looked at was, well, what if we compare effects from that are reported in peer-reviewed journals versus other kinds of outlets? And we do see, evidence, not definitive evidence, but consistent with a story around kind of publication bias. So effect sizes, twice as large in the peer-reviewed journals than in the other types of publications. So potentially that may have also been contributing to kind of inflated expectations here. And then I want to move on to talk a little bit about this second research question, right? So now that we, hopefully have a little bit more realistic set of expectations, what can we learn about different ways of trying to scale and cut costs when implementing tutoring programs? So the first thing we looked at was sort of this issue of the number of tutored students, right? So just larger programs versus smaller programs. So here I'm plotting the pooled effect sizes in standard deviation units for math in green, ELA in purple, and the pooled estimates in blue. And so, right away you see this kind of negative relationship where programs implemented with larger groups of students seem to generate smaller impacts, although still obviously large positive impacts. And, especially seems to be driven by these reading programs with fewer than 40 students. And this general pattern does seem to kind of hold up when we introduce these characteristics into meta-regression. So especially this idea that we see smaller impacts for programs with more than 40 students. So really big impacts kind of concentrated in this group. Next thing we looked at was the location of tutoring. So let's compare, you wanted to compare programs implemented during the school day to programs implemented outside of school, like after school programs. And we sort of replicate what others have found in terms of larger impacts for programs implemented at school sites. That holds up when we introduce this into a meta-regression where we're controlling for other study and program characteristics. The cost-cutting approaches. So first we looked at tutor-student ratios, and these are just the descriptive results. So at first it appears as though one-on-one tutoring seemed to have a kind of advantage relative to the small group tutoring, although still big, meaningful impacts for 2 to 4 students in a group. Smaller, but again, still meaningful impacts for 5 or more students in a group. Although when we put this into meta-regression, basically what we find is that we don't seem to find like a one-on-one advantage versus 2 to 1. We do see some evidence that 1 or 2 students per tutor seem to have an advantage, and I'm slipping into causal language here, but is associated with bigger effects than these slightly larger groups. But it's not like a sort of linear monotonic pattern. So I think the evidence for the kind of a cut point at which you'd want to think about ratios is not particularly kind of strong and clear, although it does seem like an advantage for some of these smaller programs. We looked at dosage. So here we're plotting effects depending on the total hours that students received tutoring over the whole course of the program or year. And what we find is this kind of like upside down U pattern, especially for ELA, where we do see a kind of positive relationship between dosage and impacts at first, but potentially some evidence of diminishing returns, and maybe especially true in math. I think that the meta-regression results are kind of generally consistent with the idea that more dosage is associated with greater impacts. Although it does seem like we see some evidence of diminishing returns at, if you're talking about a program with 60 or more hours. Yeah, Tony.
Is there any way to capture whether you're looking at 40 hours in 2 weeks or 40 hours in 2 months?
That's getting back to what I was saying.
Yeah, we can do that. And Jim has pushed me on this a little bit, and I can show you some evidence on this question of like, is it all in a concentrated period? Is it spread out over time? I think these are things that we haven't, we've sort of started exploring, but haven't yet sort of, I took it out of the slides in part because we haven't yet sort of put it up to the test of meta-regression. And so I want to make sure like what we're finding is consistent, but I think those are really good questions to be thinking about how the dosage is kind of administered over time and, throughout the week, and at what length and of, program and session, that kind of thing.
Sorry, one more question.
Yeah.
Do you have any information about whether the students who take up the tutoring do so after they figure out that they're falling behind, or is it some programs start right from the beginning of the school year with extra help?
Yeah, so all the programs so we don't have like really granular data on sort of the baseline achievement of students, and they're all over, they're in different countries and all over the place. It'd be hard to do that, but we do know that at least almost all of the programs were described by the researchers as targeting students that were either low performing or sort of at risk of low performance because they were sort of disadvantaged on some other dimension that would correlate with,
Based on past.
yeah, like they're low income students of color, for example, in an urban school district or something.
Thank you.
All right, so we also took a look at tutor type. And descriptively, we find, we see large effects for both teachers and paraprofessionals, although descriptively, it sort of looks like paraprofessionals may even have an advantage over teachers. And then perhaps even more surprisingly, we see descriptively these big impacts for peer tutors. So this is K-12 kids tutoring other K-12 kids. And also really large effects for college and grad students tutoring K-12 kids, smaller but still positive effects for this group of kind of other community members. But when we put this into a meta regression framework, it sort of, we see smaller impacts for K-12 peers tutoring their, other K-12 students relative to the three kind of top performing groups: teachers, paraprofessionals, and college or grad students. And we don't see big differences between those three groups, between teachers, paraprofessionals, and college or grad students, when we put it in a meta regression. All right. We also looked at virtual tutoring, and we find much smaller impacts on the order of 0.05 standard deviations for virtual programs, but which holds up in the meta regression. But almost all of these estimates actually come from programs implemented in the post-COVID world. And so, some of them in the midst of like an ongoing active pandemic. And so I think it's, hard to know how generalizable these studies are. So a majority of them are from international contexts. Again, there's the emergency in the background or in the foreground, as it were. And then it's also, I think, questions about how representative these programs are in terms of, what's the process of selection through which these programs end up entering into research partnerships that land them in a publication of this nature.
Could you compare those results to a set of studies that were conducted in the same time period with in-person tutoring, if there were any? I mean,
yeah, it's tough because there's only like 2 studies that don't overlap. Yeah, it's tricky. Like I think we have 2 studies of virtual programs that weren't post-COVID, and then I think 1 post-COVID that's in person or something like that. So, I mean, I think there's, I do think maybe part of what this review could contribute, I'd be interested to hear your guys' feedback on this, is a kind of narrative review of some of the like emerging evidence on this question. So, we could look at some of those specific models, even in that small sample, and kind of talk people through some of those results. And maybe that's kind of worth doing, especially because these are, the previous reviews haven't included kind of virtual programs, post-COVID programs, and that kind of thing. So that could be a contribution. All right, so what do I see as kind of the big picture takeaways? I think our results suggest that both policymakers and researchers may have had somewhat inflated expectations about just the size, the magnitude of the impact we could expect with tutoring brought to scale. But that 0.187 effect size is nothing to sneeze at. I think we still want to make sure we're highlighting that the gold standard evidence does suggest kind of meaningful impacts, even when we sort of limit our sample to these more policy relevant estimates. And I can show you sort of some of our rough cost estimates, but this is a table from a piece that Matt Kraft wrote about how do we sort of think about the magnitude of effect sizes in education research. And so I would describe tutoring as, you know, an intervention that produces on average between medium and large impacts at kind of moderate cost. Scalability is sort of maybe a little bit more in the eye of the beholder. But still, I think a promising program for addressing our current moment. And then, you know, we do identify some program design features that seem promising for trying to maximize impact. But again, we want to be cautious about sort of interpreting those causally. One thing we've talked about doing as a next step is we do have a small set of studies that have sort of multi-arm, you know, that have randomized students to different versions of the treatment. So we could do sort of within study kind of head-to-head comparisons. So like, you know, if they've randomized kids to either one-on-one tutoring or three-on-one tutoring. And so we could, you know, we see that as getting more at the kind of causal impact of those program design features. We want to look more at this, you know, idea of how program design features kind of interact with different student characteristics. So is it that, like, you know, older kids really need a higher amount of dosage or vice versa? And then we want to expand our exploration of costs, as I've kind of hinted, going forward when we're thinking about scalability. So I'll stop there, but very eager to hear your reactions and suggestions.
Great, thank you, Beth.
Thanks.
Maybe just one question to kick us off. So you didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about costs, but if you assume the sweet spot potentially is in the 500 to, I think it was $4,000 per student range. My guess is that probably $500, there are probably very few that sort of fit in that category that would have the impact you're talking about.
Yeah.
So it's just obviously raised this question about, given budgetary constraints, which are always true, but in theory now, especially post ESSER, how to justify the return on investment, either for starting a program or even for maintaining it. And I guess this sort of gets back to the online or virtual option. It didn't seem like, especially on the early reading elementary side, that there were actually too many studies. And as you mentioned, that some of the online studies are really more COVID period, and so they're therefore uncertain. So I guess the question is, if you were allocating your research resources now in terms of trying to figure out kind of how we go forward, would you be focusing more on the online and virtual models to see if there's actually some secret sauce or combination of things that actually works, that's scalable and that's affordable? And the only thing I'll raise on that front is the idea that, you know, that when you get over 100 students, the numbers deteriorate significantly is concerning, right? And that in theory, the online approach might, you know, emphasis on might, be somewhat easier to ensure consistency of delivery and experience and all the rest of that stuff. So anyway, so any thoughts on really kind of where the focus should be going forward?
Yeah, I mean, to your question about should we put resources into virtual, I think, and this is going to be a very researchery answer, I think we should be exploring that and trying to kind of pair it with really rigorous efforts to evaluate and sort of compare head-to-head different sort of program design features in order to really learn from some of these efforts to try to scale, as opposed to just like, okay, let's, you know, contract with a provider and, you know, provide it to everybody and not collect data on what's happening and that kind of thing. So I think we just don't have a lot of evidence on virtual tutoring. And I think the other piece is, and, you know, again, this has all been focused on like math and reading test score outcomes, but I think one of the other motivations and sort of what's attractive about tutoring, especially in this moment, is, you know, as students have been kind of disconnected from schools and there's, you know, a lot of evidence about mental health challenges and student well-being. I do think that, you know, there's a potential, and we don't have a lot of empirical evidence about it, but a potential kind of relational aspect of tutoring that, you know, could support sort of broader student well-being. And so I think it'd be interesting to see, like, can that piece kind of, is that theory true? And can that piece be kind of replicated in in the virtual setting. The other thing I would say is, the effects get much smaller when you limit to 100 or more students, but there's still really large, meaningful effects. So that is encouraging to me, actually, that we still see like 0.2 standard deviations when you get to 100 or more students. So, yes, I want to, it's a sort of it's a tricky dance, this, the point I'm trying to make, because I do think, we may have these kind of inflated expectations, but there's still a lot of good news here. I'll show you. Oh, that's okay.
Oh,
Well, I
just
was
one
just-
quick,
Yeah.
follow-up on that is that, so the effects during the time of the program are significant. And, the next question is, do they get sustained
Mm.
over time? So, to the extent a student is behind and they get caught up or partially caught up, do they sort of maintain that trajectory, or do they sort of lose it when they go off the program?
Yeah. We did code some information about so there may be a subset of studies we haven't explored that look at longer term effects that have follow-up measures. So that's something we could try. I'm not sure how big that sample is, but we did code that. So
Marty, you have a question?
We should go to
Paul has
Paul.
a hand up? Okay,
Paul, you can
great.
go ahead. Paul?
Oh, am I
You're on.
given a chance here? Okay, so hi, Beth. Nice to see you. Great study. Very informative. I've always loved the concept of tutoring. I guess I had the expectation it was a 1.0 standard deviation effect, but I guess you brought me down to a realistic level. So thank you very much for that. But my question is, what's your control group like? And because a lot of these results could be a function of the characteristics of the control group, not characteristics of the intervention. So you might expect to have tutoring having a bigger impact relative to certain kinds of control groups rather than others. And that might especially apply to online, because online learning, that might be people who volunteer to participate, and the control group might be, I don't know how they select, when they do it randomly, they have to do it from volunteers. So the volunteers online might all be pretty high level performing students. So you're going to have really good tutoring to show effects. So can you just talk about the control group a bit?
yeah, thanks, Paul. That's a great question, and good to virtually see you. So one thing we tried to do was limit our kind of treatment control contrast to, comparisons between tutoring and, a sort of business as usual control group where there's not, so we're not kind of comparing here different versions of individualized instruction to each other. We're trying to isolate, focus on estimates that isolate the impact of tutoring. Now, that said, we haven't done, I think, what you're suggesting, which is a really good idea around, so it could be that, for example, where the online tutoring programs implemented was the control group also in online school at that time, like what was happening for them. And so we've qualitatively coded some of that stuff, but haven't yet analyzed it. And I think that's a really good theory about what could be driving some variation in effects. So we should definitely try to look at that more rigorously. Thanks.
Well, just to follow up on that, and also on the online thing, which I think is one of the most significant policy implications of your research here, the online thing, maybe you want to compare that to in-person, where you have a fairly large number of students involved, because online is always, well, we think of it as always at scale. And so shouldn't you be comparing that with other at scale interventions? And is there such a large, I think there will still be a big contrast, but it may not be, it's not a difference of 0.4 and 0.05. It'll be something different from that.
Yeah, I think the direction of the effect holds up when we put this in a meta regression. So when we compare virtual programs controlling for program size, but it escapes me like the magnitude of that difference. And, it's tough. These meta regressions, it's like hard to interpret these coefficients because the, excluded group is like a very specific group, but that would be worth doing, trying to disentangle the kind of magnitude of the difference once we put this in a meta regression.
Other questions?
So, I, it's an observation that I'll try to turn into a question. I think the most interesting thing that I learned, or the most surprising thing that I found, was that it seemed to make a relatively small difference if you excluded studies that were researcher derived
Yeah.
outcome measures, which I had always thought was sort of the main reason, and maybe that that the tutoring literature showed such large effects.
Uh-huh.
And you really do seem to be so actually I find this to be a very optimistic study, even though you're trying to rein in the expectations a little bit. I guess the question is, how do you interpret what you find really does seem to matter the most, which is the scale of either the study or the program, and presumably they're correlated. It seems to me that I interpret that in an optimistic sense, that like we are able to show these large impacts of tutoring on these very broad outcome measures.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, it seems like the scaling problem is one that we can solve.
That's good to hear. I mean, I think I'm optimistic too. Maybe, I think it feels to me, it seems like, that 0.4 is really driven by these, it's not even 100 or more, it's like the 40 or fewer, studies with really small kind of, I think a lot of those studies are sort of reading pull-out programs where and so I think we could do more maybe to, first of all, to explore, what those studies are and what the interventions are in that kind of subset, and how they're different from the larger programs. But yeah, this is a good reminder to not sort of let that headline get lost in the presentation.
And then my other question that came up during the presentation is whether you thought about you presented one piece of evidence related to the issue of publication bias by looking at peer-reviewed publications versus others, but there are other ways in which you might think about, like, I don't know, looking at the distribution of p-values, for example, and seeing if there's a sharp drop off right after 0.05 and
Yeah.
conventional thresholds. I wonder if there's a bit of a file drawer problem in this literature where people just don't even try to publish null findings.
Yeah, we haven't done the p-value piece, although that's on our radar, but we've started to do the kind of funnel plot, kind of looking at the distribution of effects. And, I think there's some evidence that, I think it's tricky because although so the tricky thing I think about the funnel plot, the sort of looking at the distribution of effects pieces, my read is that it's hard to really disentangle, like, is there just true variation in impacts? But this is a literature where actually, and I didn't show like the sort of like measures of variation of effects, we see much less, it's not a ton of variation in the impacts relative to other, so like I have a meta-analysis of like interventions to improve low performing schools, and there's lots of variability in the impacts of those interventions compared to this is much more tightly.
But here, when you have the smaller studies showing bigger effects, like
Mhm.
it seems like those studies, in order to have statistically significant findings, would need to have huge effects.
Yeah.
And if they don't get published otherwise, then that creates a problem for the
Mm.
literature,
Mhm.
right? So that could actually almost mechanically explain why you see so much larger
Mm.
effects in the very small studies.
That's a good point.
If people are not publishing null findings.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So Beth, I have two questions, but they're very different. So one question is about math versus reading. I think you show consistently larger effects of math tutoring than reading tutoring. So basically, one policy implication is if you have a shortage of funds, use it for math instruction. And but however, and maybe this is not saying you shouldn't do that. It may be that the control group is getting not very good math instruction, but reading instruction isn't so bad in the non-tutoring condition, because more teachers are excellent at providing reading instruction than at math instruction. Maybe you're getting reading instruction at home and in other kinds of contexts. So math instruction is really, if you don't get a good teacher teaching math, you're not gonna be learning it. And so really the intervention can have really a big effect. So that's one question. And the second question is very different. It's sort of saying, do you have anything to say about the problems of scaling in general? You've been focusing on scaling this program. Can you make any generalizations about scaling educational interventions?
Like beyond tutoring?
Yes.
Yeah. So thanks. Yeah, I think to the first question about subject differences, descriptively, we find some evidence of subject differences, but when we sort of put this into a meta-regression and control for other, characteristics of the studies and intervention features, we're not finding big differences between the impacts for math programs versus reading programs, which again, I think is an optimistic, aspect of our findings. To your point about the control group, it makes me think about a subset of studies that we ended up excluding. So there's a series of studies on kind of parent tutoring that we opted to exclude from this, in part because they were more, we sort of, in reading some of these, decided they were more like professional they were trainings for parents, as opposed to, and it wasn't totally always clear how much tutoring the kids were actually getting. And we thought, well, if we had like a teacher PD program, we wouldn't include that in our sample. So this parent subset of studies is not relevant, but I don't know, we could rethink that. And that could be an interesting, and maybe it'd be interesting to look at subject differences in parent tutoring. I imagine a lot of them are reading programs. There are a lot of like read with your kid kind of tutoring interventions. But so anyway, that's potentially, be interested if you all think that's of interest or relevant. And then, yeah, it's a good point. What can we sort of say about general kind of problems and challenges of scaling from this literature? In some ways, it's, I sort of highlight it as a really rare case where there was all this, kind of unusual momentum and kind of consensus around a particular policy intervention to address a particular policy problem. And so maybe it's in some ways a kind of best case scenario of, what it means to scale, and a lot of federal funding behind it. So maybe in some ways it's, not totally generalizable to your more typical efforts to scale different kinds of educational interventions. I'm not sure. I have to think a lot more about that, but it's a really good point and question. Yeah.
I wonder if you have considered self-tutoring using Academy or other similar platforms.
Yeah. We excluded those. We just did, we were just like too many studies here to so we had to kind of limit ourselves in some ways. So we focused on programs where there was at least one tutor and one tutee, where you've got at least a one-to-one class size. But I think anyway, so it's sort of a separate literature that we can't really speak to with these data, but it's an interesting question of whether those programs could and my guess is that they would be more effective for some groups and some subjects than others. I don't know if you have.
Because I'm in education technology, the way
Uh-huh.
I see it is that the scaling problem is mainly an execution issue, because you have difficulty in controlling the standard of the tutors, controlling the standard of the environment. So the only way to solve that is through education technology. technology to personalize the tutoring with the AI and the other tools. Because I'm from the industry, so that's my.
Yeah, that's your bias. Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, again, our findings suggest that, you know, across a lot of these design features, like, you know, I'm talking about differences in the magnitude of effects always, but I'm always comparing positive effects, no matter the, you know, the program design feature that we're isolating. So, you know, in some ways, I mean, one interpretation is like maybe there's not as much of a problem as you're describing, that like across a range of different program designs, we can achieve positive effects. I think the question is just like, you know, are there ways that technology could be deployed to do that in a more cost-effective way, or to personalize, or to like really maximize the magnitude of the effects?
I have a question regarding like, just to confirm first, in terms of like the scale, is it like the number of samples in the study that you are conducting, or like, yeah, how would you get that scale actually?
Of like the size of the program? Yeah, it's like the size of basically the treatment group in the study, in the, you know, impact evaluation studies, yeah.
So in that sense, have you explored the idea of like really thinking about the scale for implementation unit? What I mean by that is, for instance, if you have like a sample of 100 in one school and 100 in 5 different schools, so like 20 each, would that actually make a difference? Because then implementation wise, that might actually, yeah, it might be different, because when you implement something which is small at school level and big as school level, that might actually, like, have you thought about that as well?
That's a great idea. We have not looked at that yet, but we did code like number of students and number of schools. So I think we have the data to do it. So that's a great suggestion. Yeah.
I'm not sure if you mentioned this already, but I was curious to understand, I know you said in-classroom tutoring was found to be more effective. Was virtual tutoring typically, like, was it mixed across in-classroom tutoring versus after-school tutoring? And I ask partly because I'm curious about how the role of the teacher changes when you have in-classroom tutoring and small group instruction.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, most of the virtual programs were implemented like during the school day, but, you know, for the programs that were implemented during COVID shutdown period, like what that means, I think is pretty different
Oh,
than,
that's interesting.
yeah. Yeah. So it's like during school time, but it's kind of to Paul's point also about the counterfactual, and so we could probably think a lot more deeply about that. The like at school versus out of school time, you know, I suspect a lot of that is due to just, you know, you've got a captive audience during the school day, and so who shows up to the tutoring program out of school is going to be different, and maybe not the students who could benefit the most from the programs. Although, you know, it'd be interesting to try to kind of test that empirically. I'm not sure if we can, maybe we can, to think about it.
Just to follow up on that a little bit, and this, I'm sure this is outside the scope of the study, but either you want to sort of hypothesize about it or think about how this might affect things you look at going forward. But the extent to which the tutoring is integrated with or complementary to the regular instruction.
Yeah.
As opposed to it's, you know, it exists sort of in its own dimension and it's not really connected to what's going on in school, might have a big impact on what its ultimate effect is. And just one example potentially of this is the use of in-class online tutoring to facilitate small group instruction for the other students who aren't engaging with the tutoring at that time. And then the other around the reading part is you could imagine the tutoring focusing, and I guess this could be math too, but certainly on reading, on more sort of skill development as opposed to sort of broader reading comprehension, if you will. So that, you know, when you're going to tutoring, you're getting extra support around phonics or decoding and things like that, so that the teacher may be reinforcing that in her instruction, but also sort of focusing on broader comprehension, vocabulary, background knowledge, et cetera. Anyway,
Yeah.
I doubt that you've been able to sort of peel the onion that deeply in these studies, but I'm wondering if that sort of holistic evaluation of tutoring as a support to regular instruction might be worth looking at.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that kind of qualitatively read, that I've written, that I hear from folks who are implementing these programs on the ground, the need to sort of make sure that the tutoring isn't totally divorced from, and kind of taking students out of like, what they're learning in the moment in the classroom.
Around to, whatever bad instruction. That's a
Yeah.
point on.
Yeah. I think we had trouble thinking about how to code that quantitatively from these studies, just because, it's kind of seemed like it was hard to sort of standardize whether you would count a program as well aligned with what was happening in the class based on some of these descriptions, but that may be something that we can try to more qualitatively, like sort of in a kind of synthesis type of narrative effort, just in our own reading of these studies, like whether that pattern seems to, those patterns seem to emerge or not. Yeah, it's definitely makes sense in theory, so I would guess it would kind of pan out empirically, but.
Maybe we have time for one more question before we close.
I was wondering if you have looked more into like how the RCTs work. So if if people are selected to participate in the study, can they opt out, or it's more like they're obliged to do it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we haven't examined whether that like changes effects, but we do have the data, I think, to get at that in the sense that we, collected sample sizes for like the group of students that were randomly assigned to the tutoring intervention, and then the group of students that actually ended up receiving, for those studies that reported that out, like the treatment on the treated versus the intent to treat kind of samples. So that's a good idea. We could look at the extent to which that's occurring and whether that predicts effects. Is that kind of where you're going with it?
Like if people can self-select into a study, then there's probably, like a larger effect than,
Yeah.
because they're more motivated to like improve their test scores.
Yeah, I will say we have a number of flags for kind of basically study quality in terms of the like internal validity of our estimates. So when we would read things like, because some of these studies are like quite old, and you'd read like they would write that they randomized students, but then they're like, but then we moved this kid over here, and it was like, that's not random at all. Like what? And so we have like a flag. We have a couple different flags of basically concerns we have about the validity of the estimates, and have done some work to kind of test whether our findings are sort of robust to excluding the studies where some of the things you're describing are happening. Yeah, because we want to make sure that's not the case.
So any concluding remarks, Beth? Any final takeaways?
Well, it's just a pleasure and a privilege to you've kind of been working on this, so it's really great to just be in thought partnership with you all and get some great ideas for how to carry this forward. Thanks a lot.
Well, great. Thank you so much for this. And we'll see you all in 2 weeks. That was great.
Yeah, thank you.
It was really good.
Awesome. Thanks, you guys. Yeah, I got lots of good ideas. Our to-do list is
I think